Hi, my name is Betty Davis, and I choose the Tiananmen Square protest of 1989 as my subject. These protests were important because it was a bloodshed moment when many pro-democracy supporters were killed for standing up for their rights against an oppressive government. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 were student-led demonstrations in Beijing, the capital of the People's Republic of China, in 1989. The protests were forcibly suppressed after Chinese Premier Li Peng declared martial law. In what became known in the West as the Tiananmen Square Massacre, troops with automatic rifles and tanks killed at least several hundred demonstrators trying to block the military's advance towards Tiananmen Square. The number of civilian deaths has been estimated variously from 180 to 10,400. Set against a backdrop of rapid economic development and social changes in post-Mao China, the protests reflected anxieties about the country's future in the popular consciousness and among the political elite. The reforms of the 1980s had led to a nascent market economy which benefited some people but seriously disaffected others. The one-party political system also faced the challenge of legitimacy. Common grievances at the time included inflation, limited preparedness of graduates for the new economy, and restrictions on political participation. The students called for democracy, greater accountability, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech, though they were loosely organized and their goals varied. At the height of the protest, about 1 million people assembled in Tiananmen Square. The Chinese government was internationally denounced for the violent military response to the protests. Western countries imposed severe economic sanctions and arms embargoes on Chinese entities and officials. In response, the Chinese government verbally attacked the protesters and denounced Western nations who had imposed sanctions on China by accusing them of interference in China's internal affairs, which elicited heavier condemnation by the West. It made widespread arrest of protesters and their supporters, suppressed other protests around China, expelled foreign journalists, strictly controlled coverage of the events in the domestic press, strengthened the police and internal security forces, and demoted or purged officials it deemed sympathetic to the protests. Protests initially started off peacefully, and students used nonviolence. When Hu Yaobang suddenly died of a heart attack on April 15, 1989, students reacted strongly. Most of them believed that his death was related to his forced resignation. Hu's death provided the initial impetus for students to gather in large numbers. In university campuses, many protesters appeared eulogizing Hu, calling for a revival of Hu's legacy. Within days, most protesters were writing about broader political issues such as freedom of the press, democracy, and corruption. Small spontaneous gatherings to mourn Hu began on April 15th around Monument to the People's Heroes at Tiananmen Square. On the same day, many students at Peking University and Tsinghua University erected shrines and joined the gathering in Tiananmen Square in a piecemeal fashion. Organized student gatherings also began on a small scale in Xi'an and Shanghai on April 16th. Facing internal discord and declining engagement with the student body at large, a group of charismatic leaders called for more radical measures to regain momentum. They believed that the government's dialogue was merely a way to trick the students into submission. They began mobilizing students for a hunger strike on May 11th. Students began the hunger strike on May 13th, 2 days before the highly publicized state visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Knowing that the welcoming ceremony for Gorbachev was scheduled to be held on the square, student leaders wanted to use the hunger strike there to force the government into meeting their demands. Moreover, the hunger strike gained widespread sympathy from the population at large and earned the student movement the moral high ground that it sought. By the afternoon of May 13th, some 300,000 were gathered at the square. Inspired by the course of events in Beijing, protests and strikes began at universities in other cities, with many students traveling to Beijing to join the demonstration. Generally, the demonstration at Tiananmen Square was well ordered, with daily marches of students from various Beijing area colleges displaying their solidarity with the class boycott and with the demands of the protest. The students sang the Internationale, the World Socialist Anthem, on their way to and at the square. The movement, on the wane at the end of April, now regained significant momentum. By May 17th, students from across the country poured into the capital to join the movement, protesting various Protests of various sizes were occurring in some 400 Chinese cities. That all changed, and the violence started at about 10 p.m. on June 3rd. This is when the 38th Army opened fire on protesters at the Wukesong intersection at Changnan Avenue, about 10 kilometers west of the square. The crowds were stunned that the Army was using live ammunition and reacted by hurling insults and projectiles. Song Xiaoming, a 32-year-old aerospace technician killed at Wukesong, was the first confirmed fatality of the night. The troops used expanding bullets, which are prohibited by international law for use in warfare, which expand upon entering the body and create larger wounds. The violence escalated and continued as students fought back against the soldiers. The violence would continue on for days. Unfortunately, the aftermath of the incident was not ideal. Some top party leaders were forced to step down for their sympathy for those student protesters who went on stronger hunger strikes. Conservative CPC members gained more power, and even then, the actual boss had less control over Jiang Zemin, who became the new party leader and still had influence on Chinese politics today. Second, freedom of the press and freedom of the speech had been more severely suppressed. A lot of Chinese media were punished for supporting the protests. Foreign media was restricted from entering China, and some foreign journalists were expelled in the following weeks. Next, the economic reform in some provinces was slowed down, but it didn't take long before Deng Xiaoping made the reform carry on. Fear arose in Hong Kong that the CPC might also suppress their freedom after 1997, since it was scheduled to be taken over by China. Hong Kong saw a wave of mass immigrations to countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia after 1989. Lastly, China's international trade was affected. Foreign loans suspended, tourism revenue decreased, and foreign direct investment commitments canceled, all while arms embargoes were enforced on China.